Keir Starmer heads to the White House this week. What will he say? What can he say to President Trump, who seems determined to rewrite history and tear up the settled world order of 80 plus years? What does yesterday's election result in Germany mean for Europe and the world? And on the domestic front, how much trouble is Labour in with business? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Well, yes, I'm back, having missed last week and the fascinating discussion about headlights. For fuck's sake. Rest assured, listeners and viewers, we will not be going anywhere near those sorts of exciting subjects today. Instead, we'll be focusing and concentrating on world affairs in the first part of our conversation. Myself with Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock as ever. And of course, there's been much happening over the past 7 days as far as the Ukrainian conflict is concerned in particular. We're going to really study what is happening there, and I suppose analysing what Keir Starmer as the British Prime Minister and indeed his French counterpart Macron can do when they go into the White House this week to attempt to persuade Donald Trump to perhaps rail back a little on some of the comments that he's made in relation to President Zelensky and to the Ukrainian conflict. So let's start with those absolutely atrocious comments that Trump made last week. And first off, he said that Ukraine had started the war, which was news to everybody else in the world, I think. And secondly, that Zelensky was a dictator and that he'd refused to have elections. And he then got particularly peeved when Zelensky actually tried to get Trump off the hook to an extent and say, oh, he's been the victim of misinformation. He simply pushed back on that and dug in a bit more. So I think there's several things going on here, isn't there, Joe? One is that he's clearly got a personal problem with Zelensky, and that goes back to the time when he was asking Zelensky to come up with some dirt on Joe Biden and his son Hunter. That was pre the 2020 presidential election in the United States. And now you've got the Ukrainian government pushing back on this idea that America should just come in and pillage all of Ukraine's minerals for the $350 billion that America has spent on the war. In fact, the figure is half of that. And again, another lie that Trump told was that America had spent more than all the European countries collectively. That's not true either. What's going on, Joe? Is he simply Putin's puppet, or is this another example of a great deal maker who's going to pull something out of the hat?
I think he's Putin's puppet, but he's also Musk's puppet. And I think both of them are Putin's puppets, actually. I think Donald Trump, he knows what he says is untrue, and anyone can tell you. Even Boris Johnson, who, as you know, I can't bear, has come out and said, to say that Ukraine started the war is ridiculous. It's like blaming a swimmer for being attacked by a shark. And I think, all that Trump has done has actually reignited and, in fact, re-fired up the huge support for Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. And it may well be that this has backfired on Trump incredibly. The thing is, Frank, who's he talking to? Because the American public, I don't think, really care. Ukraine is a country thousands of miles away, although the Americans don't seem to recognise that Alaska is only 55 miles from Russia, not very far. So who's he actually doing? It's just an ego trip to say ridiculous things. But this level of ridiculousness and the vile, very personal nature, Zelensky is not a dictator. You cannot possibly have elections during a war. We didn't have elections during the Second World War. Zelensky has also, gamesmanship, has said he's quite happy to stand down once there's peace. If that would
I'm not sure that was a great move, Joe, I have to say.
Well,
I felt that was Zelensky almost at least half bending the knee to Trump's bullying. I think he should have dug in more. I think by saying, well, if you allow us to perhaps join NATO, or if peace is, as a result of me standing down, I don't think that particular issue should even be on the table at the moment.
I take your point, Frank, but I mean, it was in an interview. It wasn't like he came out and made a statement. So somebody said, would you be willing to stand down? Well, you've only got two answers, haven't you? And I think in that context, I think it was the right answer. And it was a way of saying, look, I'm not hanging on to power at any cost, unlike your mate in the Kremlin. So I'm not sure what Trump hopes to achieve by this, other than the blessing of Vladimir Putin.
The other point that Trump was at pains to make was, well, we've got the Atlantic Ocean between us and the rest of the world, so we'll be safe whatever happens. He seems to forget that his adversaries have long-range missiles, and 9/11 is still in the memory of most of us, if not the current president of the United States. America, as protectionist as it wishes to be, is not immune to attacks from foes. And James, hard to think, isn't it, that go back to 9/11 and the Europeans rallying round the United States to support them, the UK going that little bit further in terms of the Iraq War and Afghanistan and those conflicts, which again European forces got involved in. That's all very quickly being forgotten by this administration. And the other thing, Jim, perhaps you want to pick up on, if you would, is this lack of pushback from both Republicans in America, but the silence from the Democrats is deafening. So what's going on, James? Do you have any sense of any tactics that perhaps are going on from the domestic politicians in the United States, or are they still all in a state of shock?
Well, if I may, I'll come to the Democrats in a moment, but just on the general picture, I mean, I think Donald Trump is obsessed with this failure by the western part of the NATO alliance to actually pay its way. I think that's really got under his skin. That consistently over the years, we have luxuriated, as he would put it, in our social security benefits and things like that. And maybe we'll come back to that, because what's coming down the road in terms of the implications for our domestic expenditure based on the need to spend on defence is something which perhaps we may come on to. But overall, I think, he is determined to get a debate going, and he certainly succeeded in that. I mean, there is now a very lively debate about what NATO actually means to us and what we're going to do to be good NATO members and all that sort of thing. So I think
I absolutely take that point, Jim, and I think that there is a case to be made. The failure of other NATO countries and partners to basically smell the coffee as far as this particular debate is concerned, because as far back as Obama's presidency, there were signals coming from America that they were unhappy with the contribution that other NATO members were making financially, and the isolationism that obviously is writ large into the Trump presidency is actually something that Obama and Biden lent into, although obviously to a lesser extent. Point though I would make, Jim, is even if that is your politics, there is absolutely no excuse, in my opinion at least, for him to start to basically peddle the Putin line and the Putin lies. Ukraine started the war. Zelensky is a dictator. Those sort of comments cannot be excused because NATO partners have not coughed up their fair share of financial contribution.
Yes, I think you hinted at it earlier there. I think there's a bit of personal animus between the two leaders, going back to the Hunter Biden thing. I think because Trump is very prone to taking offense on a personal basis and setting aside world strategic issues which are of great importance because of the Hunter Biden thing. And also, I think he thought that the previous president was taken for a ride. You know, he called Zelensky the best salesman ever to come to Washington, where he would come over and see President Biden and go back with millions of dollars in defense spending. So I think there are those sort of things that...
Forgetting again, of course, that that particular financial package of support was approved by Republicans in Congress. It wasn't a check that Joe Biden simply signed off. It had the support, cross-party support, and many Republicans backed that particular policy as well.
And was never done as a loan.
No, no.
But coming on to your other point about the domestic situation, because we have this extraordinary situation, really, that there isn't a permanent sort of in a way in which we can identify Kemi Badenoch as the leader of the opposition in this country. It sort of doesn't happen in the States. You know, you have this rival candidates for the presidency, and then, you know, when Harris was beaten, she becomes a non-person. So there's no sort of real leader of the Democrats. And but I mean, you know, I don't want to sort of divert too much, but we're in America itself. We're seeing the Trump project absolutely ferociously being implemented now. I mean, can you imagine asking civil servants to justify their jobs? And if they don't satisfy Elon Musk, they could be sacked. I mean, where are the trade unions in America? Where are the Democrats in America? I imagine strategically the Democrats are feeling that this is not the time to sort of mount their full attack, and that they just want to see how this plays out. And if it plays out chaotically, they'll come piling back in. But it is allowing Trump and Musk absolutely rampantly to go through the domestic agenda in America, and then on the international stage, handing out these gratuitous insults to a country that's bravely fought the Russians is really quite astonishing.
His poll numbers have tumbled somewhat over the past few days, I've noticed, in the States of Trump's, and we'll come back to his domestic policies in a future episode. But let's stick with Ukraine, and let's stick with what we and our European partners are going to do to react to this new world order that Trump seems determined to impose upon us. And Joe, Keir Starmer is due at the White House, I think, on Thursday. Macron is there today. We'll come on to the German election and the comments that the new Chancellor-elect has made today, which I think very positive and pragmatic, actually. But what would you be advising Mr. Starmer, Prime Minister Starmer, to be saying to Trump? Because it's a difficult balance to strike, Joe, isn't it? I'm sure I know what Keir Starmer would like to say to him, but that's not quite what is going to happen, is it?
I think this could be Keir Starmer's absolute defining moment. And I think for all the things that we and many others criticise him for, his caution, his rather dull delivery, the fact that he's a lawyer, not a politician, all of those things I think will be absolutely vital in his dealings with Trump. Now, it seems that they do have a reasonable relationship. Starmer and Lammy went over there before the election and apparently got on quite well, you know, in spite of the comments that David Lammy had made previously about Trump. And I think, you know, it's very interesting in the speech that Keir Starmer gave today to the sort of European leaders who are in Ukraine, but Keir Starmer did it remotely. He spoke about, you know, Britain's support on ending support which goes from His Majesty the King to the NHS workers who are volunteering in hospitals. And it's those sort of nuances that will be totally wasted on Trump, but actually not the rest of the world, because that in a way is saying, you know, we know Trump is obsessed with the royal family. Well, there you are, fair and square. Keir Starmer wouldn't have said that without the okay from the King. So I think those sort of things are quite good. You know, I've heard a million diplomatic experts and former ambassadors over the last few days saying, you know, well, you've got to do this and you mustn't do that. And you think, good heavens above, this is like looking after a 3-year-old for half an hour. And when he gets bored, you get out the potato prints and then we'll clear up the mess afterwards. But, you know, in the end, Trump is vain and shallow and obviously has got no concept of anything other than his place in the world. And I think Keir Starmer is very well able to put across a view that, you know, you could end up, Mr. President, looking like a complete loser by giving in to, and your opportunity here to be remembered in history, Nobel Peace Prize, blah, 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 completely get what you're saying about NATO spending and all the rest of it. And actually it goes back further than Obama, Frank. It goes right back to JFK in the 1960s. You know, it is not new. And there is some element of, you can say to Trump, actually, you know, you're quite right. And we have ignored it. And, you know, it's great that you've got us thinking about it. And it's great that we're all talking to each other in Europe. And Europe needs to be much more independent of America. We think that's absolutely brilliant. But how can we do it together with a backstop? So I think he is very well placed. And I think I may be proved wrong. But this might be where he really comes out shining. And I think, you know, two boring men, Keir Starmer and Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, are much more of a match for Trump and Musk because actually they're totally opposite to his showbiz. He's a showman, but he's, you know, he's very, very insecure and very, very shallow, like most showmen.
So on the basis of a potential state visit, James, the other thing I think that Starmer and Macron will have to offer is an increase in defence spending. And I think that makes perfect sense anyway for Europe to look at where we are this moment in terms of world affairs. And I would suggest come to the conclusion that it's in their own interest to up that defence spending. We can no longer rely on the United States, and anyway, should we ever have done so to the extent that we are. And that brings you, of course, then to the challenge of where you find that money. But before we turn to that, do you agree with Joe that it's a case of Keir Starmer going into the White House and almost cajoling Donald Trump along and thinking, look, you're going to look like a bit of a loser if this deal goes ahead in the way it's been presented so far?
Yes, I do, but I wonder if he's going to dare to say to him, look how you messed up, Mr. Big Deal Maker, over Afghanistan, because it was, you know, you were the author of giving the Taliban everything they wanted, and they came surging back, even though it was under the previous president. So, you know, I think he gently needs to make the point that Joe's making, that if you want your place in the world, just think if you have been completely fooled by Putin and you put in an inadequate sort of ceasefire arrangement, which leads ultimately either to the complete overrun of Ukraine by Russia or its subjugation in such a way that it has no meaningful sovereignty, you're going to look an idiot. Now, you'll have to put it very, very carefully, because
you can't use that word.
No, he can't. He's got to be very careful. And I imagine Peter Mandelson will be hovering in the corridor as well to make sure that Starmer's completely briefed on how to approach this. But it is a real test for him. I mean, to be fair to Starmer, he has been criticised, or he was criticised particularly in the early months of his prime ministership, for being abroad too much. But he has made contacts around the world, which could be quite useful. But you know, he's got to try and get this US backstop guarantee for Ukraine, because that's the only thing that'll be credible. Because as you've said, Frank, we haven't paid enough attention ourselves in Europe to being a credible force. We do need the heft and backup of the United States to make any ceasefire or future arrangements for Ukraine credible.
Yeah. So it then does bring us on to that problem of increasing defence spending, because that will be the very least Donald Trump will be expecting to hear from his European counterparts. And where do you get the money? And the only thing that I can think is an option for Rachel Reeves is for her to say, as was the pandemic, these are exceptional circumstances. My fiscal rules will remain, but for this particular issue of defence spending, I'm going to go and borrow additional cash and keep it outside of the books. And you may think, well, didn't Liz Truss try and do something like that and the markets kicked her all over the place? But of course, Liz Truss didn't have a plan. It was a case of tax giveaways and nothing resulting in it. I think if you went to the markets honestly, openly, and said, this is basically the UK and Europe putting itself on a war footing, the money is going to be invested in hardware, then she may be able to generate the cash that she needs to increase our defences. Jim, what do you make of that sort of option? Do you think that's where she's likely to go?
You can tell, can't you, Joe, that before this man was a business entrepreneur, he was a politician. That is a that is a brilliant, because you know, she can say this is an unforeseen circumstance. You know, the stance that Trump has taken on NATO is groundbreaking, is game changing. And you know, I have to reflect in my budget the call from the Prime Minister to do this, because the other thing that was looming up last week was a potential great bust up between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister over this, and they'll certainly want to try and avoid that with the other problems that they've got. So that is an ingenious way of getting around it. One other thing I'd just like to say is there's been talk about all these Russian assets, and why don't we confiscate them? And I'd be interested in your and Joe's view on this. Apparently the problem is, and I have some sympathy with it, that we've got to be very careful with our worldwide reputation, because we hold a lot of assets in this country. Yeah. And, you know, the circumstances are quite, you know, you can make a case against Russia, but if we seize those assets rather than froze them, it might make a lot of other countries very, very reluctant to leave their assets in this country, which could have unforeseen financial circumstances. So that's a further temptation. But I think your suggestion of easing the rules, well, it's certainly better than saying to the health service and to the education and to the prisons in this country, I'm sorry, we've got to take money off the top. I mean, and it raises an intriguing question where public opinion lies on this. I mean, you know, does public opinion perceive this great Russian danger if it's going to mean longer waiting lists and things? That's a huge question for the British public. I'd like to see some polling on it.
I think that you have several problems, don't you, if you're Rachel Reeves? One of which is 11% cuts, which is what you'd be looking at to get defence spending to where Keir Starmer wants to take it. Not going to happen. You're not going to get Parliament's support for that. More tax increases, well, we'll come on later to the opinion of business about the Labour government at the moment, but we are currently being taxed more than we've ever been taxed before. So I don't think that's an option that is really on the table for it. So my suggestion, and the suggestion of others, as I say, saying this is an exceptional circumstance and breaking our own financial rules, or fiscal rules, sorry, is to me the way to go. But then here is the other problem, and one that I sadly don't have an answer for. Thank you for your kind remarks, James. But where do we spend the money? And how can we fix the hellishly expensive and time-consuming procurement rules around defence? Because we have wasted more money than we've spent on defence on occasions in recent times. And Joe, you've got to start to think about wars in the 21st century as opposed to The last one we fought, World War, European War, no, people will be looking at what's happening in Ukraine and thinking, well, it's tanks and it's hardware. But is it 1 million drones, for example? Is it a defence system for the UK? Where would you go with that additional cash?
Yeah, all of those things. And I completely agree with your analysis, Frank, which is exactly what the European Union are doing, led by Ursula von der Leyen. And had we not left, were we still part of it, we would be doing precisely that, breaking the fiscal rules for all European countries in order to increase defence spending. Well, there are several things as I do. I'd get on the phone to George Robertson and say, right, come on, what is in your defence review? It's due out in the spring. Well, March the 1st is the first meteorological day of spring next week. We need to know exactly what's there and what are the things that, members of the armed services and defence experts are saying we need. The other thing that I thought was particularly chilling, and God knows there's enough that's chilling coming out of the White House these days, was the suggestion that Elon Musk could turn off his Starlink satellite system over Ukraine, but leave it okay for the Russians to use. Well, that's like giving them arms. It's also like something out of a horrible James Bond film. So it may well be that you're absolutely right. Nobody expected to see trench warfare at the beginning of the 21st century. So maybe it is something that guarantees that sort of internet capability that is not dependent on the whims of one very rich, rather maverick person in the White House. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration. And I think it's very interesting. I was doing the paper review last night for 5 Live, and all the papers, so they're today's papers, are so behind Zelensky. And I know that's part of the British psyche. We like the underdog. We hate the Russians. They're the baddies. He's the goody. And, none of those things are completely true. But there is a sense that even the papers that are hostile to Keir Starmer are very supportive at the moment of we need to fight Putin. And the Daily Mail, which is, in between the endless paragraphs on what people are wearing and how much cellulite they've got, is a hideous breakdown of how quickly we'd all be destroyed and how easy it is for Putin to launch a nuclear strike. So I think all of that comes back to people. And I think, if you work with Europe, and again, I come back to this thing that Keir Starmer is in quite a strong position, even though we're outside of Europe, he's in a strong position because of that, because it allows him to be the bridge between Trump and the European Union. But it also means that while France is in slightly more stable than it was a few weeks ago, but not hugely, Germany will come on to in a minute. But, he looks measured, sensible, in control. He can be quite a uniting voice to get Europe together, that it's got to be a united thing, that what are we going to spend it on? And to use your analogy of COVID, is it going to be vaccines? Is it going to be prevention? Or is it going to be cure and treatment?
And I suppose that we do need to come to some sort of security deal with our European neighbours and recognise that we can't be reliant upon outside forces. And as I say, even if you got a Democratic president in 4, 8 or 12 years' time, whenever Donald Trump decides to give the job up, we're going to be in a situation where American politics has moved in a different direction. We have to accept that reality and start to look to the longer term, not simply this short-term crisis. But I was listening to a couple of generals having a conversation on sometime, maybe a podcast, maybe a television debate, saying, to build a decent warship these days, you're looking at 10 years. So we need a short-term plan, a medium-term strategy, and then a longer-term security plan in place too. But Jim, interestingly, on Sunday, there was this election in Germany. Now, the headline, of course, is AfD, the far right in Germany, have made huge gains. They've doubled the vote to 20%. So this is basically Trumpism on the march in Europe. The German press, and indeed the mainstream German parties, have presented a slightly different spin and said even with Musk's backing and X as the main social media platform and apparently Russian influence, AFD have failed to make the breakthrough. And I think that's an optimistic, and maybe even people like you and I look at that through, yeah, I think it's what's the word? Tinted spectacles. So a result, Jim, that we've got to take account of. But then on the positive side, the new Chancellor-elect, it's not Scholz. Scholz is the guy who lost. Merz is I think saying the right things in terms of realignment of Europe and Europe starting to stand on its own 2 feet, for want of a better phrase.
Yes, and of course he's hit the headlines by reprimanding particularly Elon Musk for and not only, as he said, interfering in the election, but I understand Musk has sort of congratulated the far right on their performance. Yeah, their performance wasn't quite as good, but nevertheless, you know, given all the, and I know our German friends do tire of this, and I understand that, but given the back history of Germany, you know, the support for an ultra-right party does bring all sorts of echoes from history and so on. So it's something that we have to take into account. And, you know, as I've often said on this podcast, I do think it's a result of, you know, of the European Union countries not paying enough attention to immigration. It is an issue with people, and liberals and Democrats have got to take this into account because people are fired up by it. And then when it's given the sort of rocket boosters of Trumpism in whichever country that arises, it's going to be something that's you know, got to be taken into account of. But I think, you know, the generally speaking, this crisis isn't over yet. I mean, I think the exclusion of the far right from any coalition government or taking part, you know, the danger of that is, I'm not saying they should be included, but the danger always is that plays into them. It's a sort of Trumpian playbook thing. Look at that. This is the old guard. They're keeping us out of, you know, your voice isn't being listened to. So I think the new Chancellor will have to take into account these anxieties and also get the German economy going again, because as you know, people have experienced going there, particularly with the football last year. You know, the communications, the trains were not running on time. So there's been a slippage in the German economic performance, and you know, we'll see what this new Chancellor does. But I do think he was right to speak out against the interference that was going on, you know, from the sort of the Musk people supporting the AfD. I really don't know what. I think Musk is becoming increasingly deranged, actually.
Well, Merz, I think, as I say, has made a really strong statement last night after it was announced he would become the new Chancellor. And I think he will be emboldened, actually, to distance himself from the AfD. He is determined to put that message out there to say they've not done as well as they ought to have done. And actually, the crisis with Ukraine and the United States, and this focus that there will now inevitably be from Germans on bloody hell, what does the future look like, and what does this Donald Trump actually believe in? That could help, certainly in the initial period. It takes a bit of pressure off those other domestic issues that Jim has alluded to there, immigration and the economy, Joe, because people in Germany, if we think that Russia is a threat to us, then listen, those guys are cheap by jowl. So they are going to be fearful of what Putin could do next if he wins the Ukraine war.
Yes, up to a point. I think Merz, don't forget, he lent on the AfD for supporting the asylum bill. I mean, it didn't get through, and it was only it was a non-binding thing that went through the German parliament a few weeks ago. But the fact that he was even willing to talk to them to get their support has not helped him in the relationship with the only party that he could conceivably do a meaningful coalition with, the SPD. You know, he might end up with the SPD, the Greens and the left. But I think Jim's point about, if you look as though the AfD, I know America has got, Germany has got this firewall, but if you look like you are ignoring 29% of the public, many of them young people, and many of them people who are really suffering economically. Now, the AfD might play to that and use the Trumpian playbook of, oh, it's all because of immigration. But the reality is it comes back to the economy, stupid. You can't ignore 20%, 29% of people who voted in a democratic election. So I think Merz has got he's got a good position. And I think, for most leaders in Europe right now, actually the Ukraine US crisis is a blessing in disguise, because it does focus minds on the bigger picture. And it means people might have to put aside their differences and work together, for the greater good and greater security and protection. But I don't think he is out of the woods yet. I mean, he's made some of the right noises, Europe is at 5 minutes to midnight and all the rest of it. And he's been very quick to slap down America. But he has got to form a stable government, because with an unstable Germany, then Europe is under even greater threat.
I think you'll see the SPD elect a new leader. I think they will take a more pragmatic approach because of the crisis in Ukraine. And I think that if they start to look wider than Europe and see what's happening in one of the other NATO allies, Canada, for example, very interesting. So over the past month, since Trump became president, the Liberals, who were dead and buried as far as everyone was concerned in terms of the election that will happen there later in this year, Trudeau's resigned, of course, have gained hugely in the polls since the election of Trump. And the Canadians are now saying, do we really want a populist like that running our country? Do we want mini Trump? And so Mark Carney, who is emerging as the favourite to lead the Liberals in Canada, good Evertonian, I would remind people, former governor of the Bank of England, he is favourite, as I say, to take over from Trudeau, and has got a fair chance of actually winning that election later in the year. As Trump's agenda starts to be clear and people recognise that it wasn't just bluff and bluster, and this guy is being run by Musk, and if he continues down this path of Putin's poodle, then I think that does cause a problem for the populist right. I think it causes a problem, Jim, for Joe's mate Nigel Farage. And you've seen him doing all sorts of cartwheels and contortions this week. I've not seen Farage as uncomfortable as he is when he's trying to answer the Russian-Ukraine-Trump conundrum.
Yes, we've seen that. I mean, to begin with, if you remember, he was going to be the bridge. He was the only one who could talk to Donald Trump, and he got a lot of kudos for that. And he was leaving everyone in his wake. But now that Trump has come out with these outrageous statements, it has been very interesting to see that he's normally right back there with a quip or with a ready answer, but he's really struggled with this issue over the last period.
Yeah, I do think that populism relies so much on the Trump playbook, and if things do start to come off the rails, then, as I say, already within a month, the poll ratings of Trump, he's now underwater with his poll ratings. If that continues, then I do think that it will impact on the electors across the world. We've seen the influence that Trump has had, and that can go both ways. Just let me bring you back now to this issue before we close the conversation. So Macron, as I say, at the White House today, Starmer on Thursday. Do we anticipate movement from America? And again, it has been notable that although Republicans in the Senate, House have not necessarily been running onto the airwaves to criticise the president, there have been some pushback from certain Republicans, and the noises coming from some of the people around Trump have been more supportive of Ukraine and Zelensky. So potentially we may see some movement in the right direction from our perspective by Thursday, Friday this week, Joe.
Yeah, I think we could. And I think, there will be an awful lot of back channel chats going on with other European leaders. Macron will obviously talk to Starmer again after his meeting with Trump today. And I think the to-be Chancellor Merz will be having those sort of conversations too. I think one of the interesting things will be whether Starmer is going to come back or use his American trip to say, right, we've agreed that we are going to increase spending along the lines that you've said, Frank, that this is what we've agreed and this is what we're going to do and here's the time frame. Now, the risk of him doing that and then being accused of being Trump's poodle is actually a risk that is worth taking if the greater picture is to give European security and therefore security to the UK. I think the other thing is that populism, in a way, it's a luxury. And I know that sounds bonkers because we talk about people being fed up and it's always about the economy. But when things really begin to go wrong and the American public are not quite yet, but they will be beginning to feel the impact of these slash and burn through the civic institutions that keep society going, whether it's education, creative industries, healthcare, so many things that all of a sudden people are going to go, hang on, what do you mean there's nobody there to deal with this? There's some 20-year-old working with a bot to deal with my social security or my veterans pension or that sort of thing. And I think at that point, people like Keir Starmer, people like Mark Carney, and to a certain extent, Merz, I suppose, they look like the grown-ups in the room, and it's sort of like, okay, right, we've played that game, it doesn't work, so let's stop being serious. The thing that I would just add on that thing, and it goes back to what we were saying about the German election, the thing that really bothers me is this leaning of young people towards the right, towards populism, because you can recruit from young people. And that means you get a stronger political movement, and I think that's quite worrying.
And I've just noticed from the exit polls coming from Germany as well, the gender difference in terms of support. So it's young men, particularly the hard right are attracting the support of. The one character personality we haven't mentioned when we've been talking about Europe is the Italian president, Meloni. And she, of course, is quite close to Trump and to Trump's politics, very anti-Russian. So again, Jim, that gives Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, the other European partners, somebody else that they can potentially use in that conversation with Trump.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I just think that, of course, Starmer's just got to keep a little bit of a look over his shoulder at the domestic situation as he talks to Trump, because these international challenges have certainly reshaped, sort of the Labour agenda. I mean, we've got a Labour government now that's talking about, big increases in defence, and I was particularly intrigued yesterday because the other thing that we haven't talked about is what the Putin's return to the top table. I mean, this is really important to have a word about this. This man that we have systematically isolated because of his appalling behaviour is now back on in the negotiations, and Lavrov, his foreign minister, is to be seen involved in negotiations. And when Bridget Phillipson, who was the cabinet member who was available on the Sunday programmes, and her brief is education, but nevertheless she was a cabinet minister, and she was asked about this, and she said, no, well, we can't do a deal without him, and so therefore he's back on the front foot. So we've got Starmer's got to be a little bit careful of his backbenchers. More defence spending. Oh well, we've got to talk to Putin. He's being pushed in a particular direction here, and I think he'll need to take that into account as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's going to cause him too many difficulties, Jim. I take your point in terms of Putin. It makes people like us three, sick to our stomach to see the guy, a war criminal, basically just being invited back by Trump into the room. It's disgraceful, really, but pragmatism sometimes dictates. And unfortunately, Bridget Phillipson was right when she said, well, without him, you ain't getting the deal. And the other thing that is hard to argue against is that Ukraine itself is nowhere near winning that war. It may have been able to continue to resist, and we can talk about the economic difficulties and challenges that Russia is facing, but he's basically been able to ally himself with China and Korea, and God forbid, but if he did get to so desperate a state as to use a nuke, then who will put that past him? So it was inevitable that at some point he'd be invited back into the room to negotiate, however distasteful people like us find that. I think that the point you make about Labour backbenchers being unhappy with increased defence spending, well, if you are worried about your red wall voters, then that's not something they're going to be pushing back against, because they hate the Ruskies and they support the army and they support defence. They want to see Britain as a strong country right in the middle of this stuff. So I'm not sure, Jim, whether that's right. I think he'd have far more difficulty, would Starmer, if he came back and said, we're going to cut 11% for public services in order to pay for it. That would absolutely, I think, cause chaos within the government, which is why I think the option of the exceptional circumstance is the Chancellor's way out. We'll know much more, I guess, by the end of the week, and obviously this is a subject that sadly we're going to have to keep returning to. But I want to move on, and we're going to have a short break. Jim and Joe are going to go out and check the LED lights and the headlamps on the cars. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. We focused on international affairs in part one of today's conversation. We're going to turn our attention now to domestic policy and in particular Labour's travails with the business community. So Downtown in Business undertook a poll last week, and we wanted to take the temperature, business opinion on the performance of the government over the past 7 months. So the question was, the Labour government has been in charge for 7 months. Do you think Keir Starmer's administration is doing as well as you expected? Which 31% agreed. Better than you expected, a paltry 2%. It's obviously Keir's mum and dad. And worse than you expected, a huge 67%. Now, I said a couple of weeks ago, much to raised eyebrows from Joe and Jim, to be fair, that following her speech on the Heathrow Airport announcement and the Oxcam spend infrastructure and some money for Andy Burnham and Old Trafford, businesses had started to at least show a little bit more positivity towards the Chancellor and the government. However, these poll results, I think, suggest that they're in a bit of a hole with business. And I've been talking to a lot of business leaders last week. I took advantage of the fact that we didn't have any events because it was half term in the Northwest. And I have to sadly say that business is, for want of a better phrase, totally pissed off, Jim. And with April the 1st looming, those big national insurance increases, of course, you then have the national minimum wage, which has gone up as well. And down the line, changes to employment legislation that, again, businesses are suspecting is going to put additional burden onto them. It's not looking good. And for a party that, courted business an awful lot before the election, they feel a little betrayed, to say the least.
Yes, and that's the point. There were such high expectations. What we used to call the Ming Vase strategy, being very careful not to frighten business and to reassure them that an incoming Labour government would have their back. Particularly the NI contributions have been a slap in the face, really. All I would say is that, you know, the Chancellor must be hoping that the things that are being put in place of a longer term nature will bear fruit in the longer term, and we'll look back on this first year or two as being the pain before the gain. But it's a real gamble, and at the moment morale is very low, and recruitment of people is worrying sort of signs in that direction as well. And you know, with the discussion that we were having earlier on, the international situation and the potential impact of defence expenditure on all those things, because that's what they've got to deliver on, you know, helping business, helping the health service, helping the schools, helping the prisons. You know, if there's less money for that, less delivery, then this initial period that's gone wrong will continue. And I have to make a separate point, which is that the various distractions that we've had over sleaze and the behaviour of certain MPs, which we may come on to later, has acted as a further distraction, and has meant that the impact of this huge majority gained last July has led to these figures. And you know, you can see it in the downtown figures. You know, that 67% of people are disappointed.
Yeah, I think that you can look back across months of conversations that we've been having in terms of the poor communication from the government, and actually a couple of business leaders I spoke to last week, particularly interesting, saying that you know, they talked the country and themselves into a much bigger crisis than was necessary, and all of that downbeat talk to say, well, we're in this hell of a mess and there's a £22 billion black hole and all of that sort of thing, they thought was totally unnecessary, actually, because the reason Labour got such a big majority was the recognition the Tories made a right bloody horlicks of it. So Rachel Reeves didn't have to necessarily take upon herself to tell us how bad things were. She needed to start to talk the country up, Joe, say things were going to get better, and then start to deliver incremental improvements. Instead, she dug a hole, and 6 months later, she's still in it.
She's in it, and it's getting deeper. And I'm not surprised that businesses feel lacking in confidence. I mean, you know, and the knock-on effect of that in every high street and every town is going to be palpable, because pubs are closing, restaurants are closing, hairdressers, all those little shops that keep high streets going, they're closing because they simply can't afford it. And I think, you know, that coupled with the rather surprising rise in inflation, although it's not very much, but it's enough to make people go, oh, and that then has a squeeze on, you know, mortgage rates, interest rates, and all the rest of it. We now hear talk about the government wanting to make a limit on the amount of money people can save in a cash ISA to try and get people to invest in stocks. Well, that will just kill the savings market, because lots of people go, I'm not going to touch stocks and shares. I don't know enough about it. I'll keep it under the mattress. So that's not going to help. I mean, there are some things that are so frustratingly bloody obvious, like you're going to build all these houses. Who's going to build them? Oh, we haven't got any brickies. We haven't got any carpenters. We haven't got any plumbers or electricians. We haven't got quantity surveyors. We're going to overhaul the planning system. Oh, we haven't got any planning officers. Now, all of these things, those should have been the announcements that could have been the upbeat bit of the bad news. Most of those things are inherited for 14 years of absolute shambles of the Tory party. But what Labour should have done, and I know hindsight is a marvellous vision, but, you know, at the same time as saying we're going to build 1.5 million houses, but we're going to make 1.5 million apprenticeship schemes that really work, or devolved training things that will make sure we've got the people to do those jobs. So none of the problems have been addressed. There's a lot of talk that nobody can see anything actually happening. And I think people are feeling the squeeze. I mean, it's been a ghastly winter, so people are worried about electricity and gas bills. Businesses are suffering for the reasons that you and Jim have said about the April the 1st coming in, and that's going to be another hit. And it's very hard to see where any good news can come from, that people can palpably feel in their pockets and their daily lives. And that's really where I think the government is so disappointing to so many people. And it's not because people don't want them to succeed. It's just you sort of like, yeah, we know the last lot were rubbish and we know you've got great plans, but we do need a little bit of, maybe not jam today, but bread today would be nice.
And where does she go, Jim? Because I suspect that her headroom for maybe tweaking one or two of the things that she did in initial budget limited, really. But the one thing I wonder if she could look at is the threshold at which national insurance contributions start to be paid, because as well as increasing the amount that employers pay, she's also announced that you will be paying that rate at a much lower level of income. So I think it's £9,000 at the moment that you have to earn before national insurance kicks in. That's reducing to 5,000. I wonder whether she could look at that to at least give some comfort and actually indicate to business, look, I feel your pain, we're listening. She's got to do something though. And I think the other thing that has frustrated me and many other business leaders in the north of England, perhaps north of the Watford Gap actually, is that every time you see the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, the Business Secretary talking to business leaders, it's in the fucking southeast. And it's with the usual suspects of the British Chambers of Commerce, the CBI. Well, with due respect to those guys, they do not represent small and medium enterprises who every politician says the right things about. Well, they are the engine for growth in the UK, but actually are totally fucking cut out of these conversations because the big companies, well, they will absorb those increases in national insurance. They will be able to cope with new changes to employment legislation. But if you employ 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, and you really are the driving engine of our economy, you feel at this moment in time that you do not have a voice. And whereas as shadow ministers, they were all over you, asking for your views, asking for your opinion, they fucking disappeared. You know, they're not coming to talk to any of us. Now, I've reached out to the government and to the Labour Party, and hopefully we'll be getting a number of ministers along to our events over the coming months. But they've got to start to engage again, Jim, and they've got to start to explain what they are going to do about these challenges business are facing. As Joe's rightly said, we could see an absolute car crash post 1st of April on our high streets and in our hospitality sector.
Yes, I think that's right. And of course, you know, traditionally, the Conservative Party have always been the champions of small business, and they don't want to hand the initiative back to the Conservatives on that. They want to be seen to be...
And to be fair, Jim, the Conservatives had not been seen as the party of business probably since Brexit, but certainly since the fuck business comment from our mate Boris.
Yes, well, obviously, we think we're all agreed on this podcast that Brexit was a huge mistake and was a very anti-business proposal. But I mean, I bow to your authority on the smaller business sector because you are one yourself and you're very much in touch with it. I would just like to touch on the slightly wider economic issues that the Chancellor might want to face, because I'm interested in this growing debate about the huge burden of benefits that just continues to balloon, and it's related to and it's a very sensitive area, but it's related to sort of mental health. But when I'm not talking about people who are clearly have major mental health problems, but there is an interesting debate beginning about the resilience of our workforce and the ease with which people are sometimes signed off because of stress and things like that. And clearly Rachel Reeves is starting to look at it because it is a massive bill. And, you know, she's got to find money from somewhere, but to have the debate and to have it sensitively is quite difficult. But I do think that there is some measure of support. There would be some measure of support for saying to people, you know, that are you really unable to work because of mental pressures? And it's a very tricky area to work on, and you need to sensitively get people back to work. But the benefits bill is becoming unsustainable, in my opinion, and something's got to be done about it. And I just find that particular aspect of it quite interesting.
Well, I think Liz Kendall is moving in that direction that you've just alluded to, Jim, and said, you know, the mental health issue in particular is something that needs to be addressed. That comes back to GPs, of course, because they are far too easy, in my experience, to just sign a form to say, well, yeah, you're off sick. I mean, these guys are GPs, they're not psychologists. And can the system cope with the numbers, the spike that we've seen in people saying that they've got mental health anxieties, all, of course, exacerbated by lockdowns and the pandemic? But we are in the European table far worse in terms of our recovery rate. Things like working from home, for example, still far too many people, in my view, working from home. And that again is something that you're starting to see a pushback. Sadiq Khan, of all people, I mean, if you were to say to the right of British politics, who's the most woke person that you can think of, Sadiq would certainly be in the top three. And Sadiq Khan has come out this week, hasn't he, and said people have got to start getting back into the office. No good for mental health, no good for productivity, and it's killing cities. Well, surprise the fucking prize. We've been saying that for 3 or 4 years now. So it's an issue, Jim. But in the big scheme of things, it doesn't even touch the sides in terms of the money that she needs to start to generate. And it is about economic growth. And unfortunately, the steps that she's taken thus far are not, from where I can see, going to really see businesses at least contributing to that growth. So maybe she's getting big chunks of inward investment. Maybe these infrastructure projects, when they get off the ground, will begin to move the dial as far as that's concerned. But as I always remind Labour politicians and the comrades, in order to redistribute wealth, you have to create some. And the people who create wealth are not the public sector, they're the private sector. So get behind business, start listening again, get back into listening mode, and start to support entrepreneurs and enterprise. Right, on that note, we'll move on quickly to something Jim referenced, which is some of these little scandals that are happening across Parliament. And of course, the Labour Party, like all governments, ends up having challenges that they need to face. It's tittle-tattle to some, but it always exercises the press gallery at Westminster. People like Jim love it. Now, on a serious note, a little bit of sad news today, because both Jim and I know Mike Amesbury, who of course got caught up in a silly spat and ended up throwing a punch at somebody. I think this was weeks after the general election. It's been announced today he's been sentenced 10 years, gosh no, 10 weeks, 10 weeks in jail. But that will be devastating for Mike on a personal level. But for the government, it will mean a by-election in Runcorn, Halton, a place where reform will certainly be targeting. Then you've had controversies over a number of ministers' CVs. Again, trivial in the big scheme of things. And if things were going well, and those results that I announced earlier we reversed, and 67% of people thought the government was performing better than they expected, then what Rachel Reeves said about a job 20 years ago, nobody had much care about. Similarly, the business secretary, Johnny Reynolds. But these trips, these mishaps, Jim, it's the exact opposite of what Keir Starmer wants and what Keir Starmer promised, which was government without the drama.
Yeah, and it just feels as if it's just a continuum, because under the Conservatives and the former Conservative chief whip has brought out a book outlining the absolute chaos that was going on under the Conservative government, with all sorts of bad behaviour, and you really hope that there'd be a line drawn under it. But to some extent, it's not quite on the same scale, but it is peppering this government. And as you rightly say, when the forward motion, this famous stagecoach, keep the stagecoach going, as Harold Wilson used to say. If the stagecoach is hesitating, and it certainly is on the economy, then attention focuses on these things. And just generally speaking, it just enhances this reputation that the politicians are badly behaved, and most of them aren't. But I mean,
they're all the same.
Yeah, they're all the same, and they aren't all the same. But some of these things are serious. I mean, this CV thing is beginning to get really serious. I just wonder whether some of these Labour people they don't have the heft of the great people that were around when I was a young journalist, and they've this sort of feeling that they've got to big up their positions because they've basically had a political life and their professional life has been fairly mediocre. And they've therefore got to sort of talk up their role as an economist or as a solicitor and all this sort of stuff to give them some extra heft, and that's the cause of this, and they're now being found out. But it is particularly unfortunate. And then, of course, we come to the politics of it, and by-elections at the moment are just what the government don't need. I mean, the Reform UK are up in arms about the cancellation of various county council elections because of local government reform, saying that the government were thwarting them from the chance to demonstrate their support. But now very likely a recall petition and so on, a by-election in Runcorn, you can imagine Nigel Farage will be up there trying to win it. And something else, we probably haven't got time to discuss this today, but this blue Labour business and Glassman, I think it's an interesting debate about what Labour's going to do to respond to reform, because it's not just the Conservatives who've got to respond to the reform challenge. But I digress. No, it's an unfortunate thing. We could start to have the by-elections, and of course we had a whole succession of by-elections in the last Parliament, a lot of them in the Northwest actually, because of misbehaviour by MPs, and it's just carrying on.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the CV issue is tittle-tattle that ordinarily will go way under the radar, but a government that's struggling will get attention for all of the wrong reasons. And I think I was smiling to myself on Saturday morning when I read that Robert Jenrick had been found to have lied on his CV, having accused, I think it might have been Johnny Reynolds, of saying something that was wrong on his. So they all do it to an extent, and I've said before, I've been into interviews where I've said I had a maths O level. So we all do those things, and ordinarily it shouldn't make much difference. But I think when you've got a very hostile press, when you've got the Westminster bubble that does get excited over these things, I have to say to you, none of the business leaders I spoke to last week mentioned CVs of the Chancellor, nor Johnny Reynolds, and indeed a number of them, particularly females, it won't surprise you, were really pissed off with this Rachel from badge that some people still continue to trot out. They just see that as a very sexist attack on the first female Chancellor. And as many people have said to me, she's far more qualified, whether she embellished her CV or not, than most of the fellas who've been in that job. So I think that the CVs aside, I think it's just that general sense that politicians, as you rightly say, Jim, don't behave particularly well. Don't fucking help themselves either when a former chief whip decides to leave the stage and then starts making all sorts of stories up. And some of them, I have to say, some of those people should be in jail if they're true. So if I was the Bobbies, I'd be knocking on that fella's door. Is it Simon Clarke? Or am I getting that wrong? Is the guy who wrote the book, Joe? Clarke?
No, Simon Clarke was the head of the civil service.
Right, who's the guy who wrote the book?
Simon Hart.
So, there's one story where he says a Conservative MP is in a brothel, and he's basically being menaced for cash. And they find that somehow they get him out of this mess. But you know, again, if you're reading that as a punter, you're thinking, what are these people playing at? And for me, you know, politicians, whether they're past politicians or currently sitting MPs, need to start to realise that just because you're throwing mud across the chamber at the other lot, or because you're looking back at things that you now find funny, the people out here, the electors, the voters, are totally pissed off with you. And it's not funny. It's not for you to be selling books on the back of that bad behaviour. You need to clean your act up. Otherwise, guess what? In 3 years' time, people will be saying you're all the same. Let's give Nigel and his mob a chance.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Frank, and I think that's why people are turning their back on politics. But I think Jim's point about, you know, politicians by and large are quite inexperienced in anything other than politics. You know, very few have run businesses, very few have done anything else, very few have served in the military in any position. I mean, there's a handful of people who've worked in the health service, you know, and various other things, but they don't bring that life experience, which gives you the confidence to say, so no, I don't have a degree, so what? You know, and that's it's that, and it's interesting actually, because the letter that Keir Starmer apparently sent to his cabinet during the half-term recess, which was about people, they've got to stop talking down to people. Well, you talk down to people if you think you're better than people. If the only way you make yourself think you're better is lying about your qualifications, then you're on a hiding to nothing to start with. You know, is the bricklayer as important as somebody who pretended to be a solicitor? Well, actually, if you want to build 1.5 million homes, yes, you want a bricklayer, not a sodding pretend solicitor. And that's something that needs to change. And that's something. And just to go back very quickly on your point on the business thing, which is that fascinating survey, you know, we have got to, and have had to, should have had for donkey's years, a much better attitude that is not so snobbish about business. We need to appreciate and recognise that the skill of a hairdresser or a veterinary nurse or a painter and decorator is as valuable, if not more so, than somebody who works in PR. And we don't, and we never have. And that's why we've got universities collapsing. We've got people not being able to get onto vocational courses to do the jobs that we need. We haven't engaged education to link up with the jobs and the vacancies that we need, and we just need to be a bit more sensible. But if you've got politicians who can't even have the confidence in their own abilities to say, yeah, so this is what I've done, take it or leave it, and be honest. People like honesty. That's why, bizarrely, people liked Boris Johnson. They thought he was honest in his buffoonery. We all know that was an act. They like Nigel Farage because they think he's honest, because he's one of them. People like Trump because they think he's honest, because he's like them. It's about speaking human and thinking human. And that's what Labour is lacking.
You just gave 3 terrible examples, Joe, because all 3 of those are lying bastards. But I take your point. Yeah, but, and I think, you know, again, I go back to the point you made. I don't think that either Rachel Reeves or Johnny Reynolds will have been trying to embellish their CV for the electors in their respective constituencies. They'll have been doing that to impress people as head office.
Yeah, but why would you say you're a solicitor? Why would you say you're a solicitor?
Because if you are trying to get into a shadow cabinet position in the Labour Party, then rightly or wrongly, Johnny's view may have been, well, you've got to say you're a solicitor, because a trainee solicitor just doesn't cuss the mustards with this fucking Westminster lot. And that is the problem. I mean, I'm not disagreeing. You know, but Steve Rotherham, I'll tell you now, Steve Rotherham, as the mayor in Liverpool, celebrates the fact that he was a brickie and he was an apprentice. And, you know, that authenticity doesn't do him any harm. But then he's not trying to get into the cabinet. And I think that there is, Joe, sadly, a snobbery around Westminster, around the Islington set, and I think it exists across the mainstream political parties. And, you know, they're very, very quick, and rightly so, to say that we've got to have a balance of women, we've got to have a balance of people who come from different ethnic backgrounds, but they never say any working class guys and girls in the room. And I, on more than one occasion, have sat round tables where I've been laughing at this nonsense of tokenism and people wringing their hands because there aren't enough black faces or there aren't enough females in the room. And I know I'm the only one sat in that room who never went to university. And unless and until we start to have political parties in our mainstream that begin to recognise the importance of diversity, that means class as well as colour, as well as gender, then we're always going to have this problem. And I think it is, you know, to an extent, that lack of confidence in people, probably largely from the Labour Party, but not exclusively, that thinks, do you know what, I better just make sure that I'm not seen as being somebody who's not worthy of a job in the shadow cabinet or the cabinet because I ain't got the right qualifications. Nonsense.
One of the things on that would be a very quick thing is you just change the way you word it. Say trained as a solicitor. That doesn't say you qualify.
Yeah, Joe, I think, you know, this will be something that will go away. You know, because nobody's raised it as an issue. But I think it comes back to that bigger problem, which you've rightly identified. But why do people feel the need to have to embellish their CV? That is the issue. And then the other side of this same coin is that, you know, somebody like me, if I was even 10 years younger than I am now, wouldn't dream of going back into elected office and public service because of the shit that they get. And that's the problem, Jim, isn't it? You're not going to be able to attract people from a diverse range of background. So increasingly, the people that we have going into Parliament now are people who've been in politics all their life because no one else with an ounce of sense would touch it with a barge pole.
Yes, and of course that's been exacerbated by social media and the ability to track back now electronically and find some faux pas or a video or something from 10, 20 years ago that you can throw against somebody. And as we've said before on this podcast, we will never know the high quality potential politicians that we could have had in public life who maybe have a black mark against them in some aspect of their private life, but who overall would bring great judgment and decision making to political life, but they won't touch it with a barge pole because of the fear of scrutiny. I mean, that's not to, you know, denigrate my professional colleagues, journalists who do investigative journalism and expose scandals and so on, but some of the tittle tattle, you do wonder whether journalistic endeavour is being wasted on that sort of thing rather than on other aspects of it. But we'll just never know. But we do observe that generally speaking, the quality of politicians in high office now ain't up to much, very frankly.
But I'd like to just give one very quick example, a recent one. 2 ministerial resignations, both treated very differently. Working class girl Lou Hay, who tried to blag a new phone allegedly 20 years ago from an employee, and Tulip Sadiq, whose misdemeanors potentially far greater than that, but had seemed at least far more empathy from number 10 and her colleagues when she had to fall on a sword. Now, is that a class thing? I don't know. But, you know, it's those sort of things that I look at sometimes and think, you're really not reading the room, Westminster. You're really still not reading the room, despite all your fine words, despite the fact that you've got these groups knocking around, Blue Labour or whatever they want to call them, and despite the fact that you've got Morgan McSweeney saying he's all for the working class. I'm not sure whether they really do understand what the working class in this country want, but we'll wait and see. Anyway, listen, talking about good working class lads, David Moyes continues to do a fine job. He was robbed on Saturday of a last-minute penalty that was clearly a pullback on Ashley Young. Plymouth managed to get a point, but the result of the weekend, Joe.
I know. The Hammers at last. pulled it out of the very bottom of an old sock, not so much out of a magician's hat, beating Arsenal.
Beating Arsenal and ending, I have to say, the Gunners' chance of a Premiership title and handing it on a plate to the lovable Reds. So congratulations, Liverpool. I'm calling it early. We're in February, and this most competitive league in the world is over and done. As are the 3 relegation places, the 3 promoted clubs of Leicester, Ipswich and Southampton. Again, calling it early. They will all be relegated, and basically everyone else is scrambling for mid-table mediocrity. So well done, Premier League, with your fucking PSL and your VAR and all your bollocks. You are slowly but surely destroying the English game. Meanwhile, what's happening in the world of Argyle and the Championship?
Well, what will be happening on Saturday is a 3rd Premier League side will be knocked out at the Etihad Stadium by the Green Army. Oh yes.
Come on.
If you saw City's uncertain performance at the weekend, that's given us great hope of another sensational victory.
Excellent. And listen, if Real Madrid can stick 6 past them, Plymouth can put 1 past them. And they're struggling to score at the moment. So very best of luck, James. We'll be back next week, guys. Thanks for listening, as always, to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. From me, from Jim, from Joe, goodbye. Have a great week.